How much more expensive is it really to live in London? When I was in Canada this summer, I was shocked by how much prices have gone up in Toronto. I lived in Toronto most of my life, and now that I moved to London for the past 4 or 5 years, I've only been going back for 1 or 2 weeks during the summer. And this time, I felt the prices have risen so much in Toronto, but I couldn't help to wonder how much more expensive is London to live in, or is it actually more expensive? So today, I'm going to compare the cost of living in Toronto versus in London with the daily cost of items in today's prices. And at the end, I'll put a rough comparison of the monthly costs to live the same lifestyle. And I'm just going to be emulating my current lifestyle, which I think is like an average young professional's lifestyle. And also making this video was a bit tough due to Canada not having tax in the prices of things versus London, which includes tax with everything. So I'm going to try my best to compare the two costs and add tax to every single item plus convert it to pounds. But just so you know, I'm using the current day conversion, which is 1 Canadian dollars equals 0.56p. Let's get into it. Okay, let's get started with groceries because this is where I noticed the biggest price increase in Toronto. I'm going to go through the typical items that one would buy at the grocery store and compare the cost. So for milk, typically in Canada, we sell them by 4-liter bags or 2-liter cartons, but of course in London, we sell them by pints. So I converted the cost to the per liter cost, and approximately a liter of milk plus tax and converted is £1.12 per liter versus in London it's about 64p for a liter, so almost half the cost. For eggs, for a dozen eggs, the cost is about £2.34 versus in London is £2.65. It is a bit higher, but I would say the typical eggs in London are free range. Vegetables, I find overall tend to be cheaper in London. So for example, for broccoli, it is about £1.58 for a head versus in London, it is 69p. Cauliflower, £1.89 versus £1.09. 3 peppers. I don't know why peppers are so expensive in Canada, but like 3 peppers in a bag costs £4.11 versus in London just £1.79 for 3. Cucumbers is about £1.26 versus here it's typically £1 or less. So yeah, vegetables I find in general are cheaper in the UK. I'm not quite sure why. Maybe there is less importing or it's cheaper to import it from Europe. But yeah, it's just vegetables tend to be cheaper and fresher here. Fruits generally, I think it's like similar or the same. So for like grapes, a pound is £2.52 in Canada versus £2.27 here in London. For bananas, they're slightly more expensive specifically. So it's about 44p for a pound of bananas versus in London, it is 88p. So for meat and fish-wise, I do feel like it is quite expensive, but I don't think in London it is more expensive than in Canada. It's about the same. So for 100 grams of salmon, it's about £1.95 in Canada, and then in London is about £1.82. And then in terms of meat, I think meat overall is cheaper in London. So for example, if you have rib steak in Canada, it's about £37.65 per kilogram versus in London is £25 per kilogram. And then ground beef in Canada is £11.85 per kilogram versus in London it's £6.98. For loin chops, surprisingly, it's a bit more, maybe because it's a less common cut in England, but it's £5.43 per kilogram in Canada versus here from Morrison's, for some reason it was £15.25 per kilogram. And then chicken here is so cheap in London. I was always shocked when I looked at the chicken prices. So for drumsticks, it's about £8.60 per kilogram versus in London is £3.54 per kilogram. And then for like boneless, skinless chicken thighs, it is £12.54 in Canada per kilogram versus here it's £6.19 per kilogram. So I always found like chicken so cheap to buy here. Now for things like bread, I feel like people in the UK eat more like artisan, locally baked bread. So the ones in the grocery store tend to be quite cheap. So for like a pack of 5 bagels that are like not branded, it's £1.77 in Toronto versus 75p in London. And then for a more like artisan looking loaf in the grocery store, it's like £2.52 in Canada versus £1.40 here in London. Now for other pantry items, so like oil, sunflower oil in Toronto is £4.11 per liter versus £1.99 per liter here. And then olive oil is also slightly cheaper here, so £9.80 in Toronto versus £7.80 here in London. Rice is also cheaper in London, so at £2.06 per kilometer, £2.06 per kilogram versus £1.60 per kilogram. And then things like canned chickpeas are even cheaper here, so 94p in Canada versus 49p in London. And it seems that milk products are also cheaper in London. So for example, butter is £3.79 for a block in Toronto versus £2 here in London. And then for like yogurt, it's 51p per like 100 grams versus 22p. And then, interestingly, honey is also more expensive in Toronto. So for like a Selections brand, which is like a no-name brand, it's £1.52 for 100 grams. And here in London, it's about 43p for 100 grams. So a lot cheaper. And then Oatly, for example, a carton is £4.42 versus here it's £2.10. That kind of makes sense because Oatly is from Sweden. So maybe there's some import costs there. A frozen pizza, the same brand you can find in Canada and in London, which I quite like. It's a Restaurante frozen pizza. It's £4.42 in Canada, and here is about £3.29. And then lastly, drinks. So if we look at coffee beans, there's like a wide variety of prices, but I would say London is slightly more expensive, but I would argue maybe the quality is a bit better. But I picked like almost the cheapest of the two, or the, reasonably priced ones, and it's about £1.04 per 100 grams in Canada versus £1.23 per 100 grams in London. And then for alcohol, I think it's to be expected that in Toronto it's more expensive because we tax alcohol more heavily. So if I'm comparing Corona, which is from America, for a pack of 6 330 milliliter bottles, it is £10.73 versus £7 here in London. And then a bottle of wine, like here wine can be really cheap, but if we're just looking at a bottle of local wine, so one that's produced in Canada, it's about £10.12 for a bottle versus here a local wine is like £7, or it could even be cheaper. But yeah, I think that gives you a good idea of the price differences from Toronto to London. Now let's look at a typical basket and how much the price differences are. So I picked out some items that I would personally buy in a typical basket to see the cost. So I have milk, eggs, broccoli, cauliflower, like all the veg, grapes, bananas, salmon, 2 types of meat, so beef, chicken thighs. I'll include the bagel and the bread, and like let's say I was stocking up with the olive oil and like a 5 kg bag of rice, 250 grams of coffee, butter, and a pack of Corona, a bottle of wine, canned chickpeas, like all this all included. So I'm gonna add this all together. So with the frozen pizza, yogurt, honey, Oatly, in Metro in Canada, this whole shop would have been £102.03. versus in London, it would have only been £67.84. So this would mean my groceries may be around 33.5% higher in Canada than they are in London. It's kind of sad to see how much prices have gone up for basic items in Toronto, and like the quality of the fruit and veg sometimes are not even that good. Now let's quickly move on to rent and housing costs, which we all know London is higher. Rent in Canada right now for a nice 1-bedroom in a central downtown Toronto is about $2,300. So a typical 1-bed, 1-bath. That is about £1,288, and this would be in a nice brand new high-rise, very conveniently located near a subway line. But if I were to find the same flat in London, it would be so much more expensive. But I would say that is not a fair comparison, because if you're living in London, you're not going to be paying that much to live in a brand new flat. That's just not realistic. So I would say a typical 1-bedroom flat that, a young professional would rent is probably around $1,700 to $1,800-ish. So I think that would be the comparison. So rent is about 32% higher in London. Now, additional costs to renting include things like utilities. So in Canada, I actually still do pay for the utilities for a condo since I own it. It typically hovers around $100 a month and it's like a one bed plus den, and that equals about £55, 54 a month. Currently I don't pay utilities at the place I'm living in, that's covered in the rent, but when I did, it was around actually £130 a month for my utilities at my old flat. So I think it is significantly higher for utilities here in London. It's about 134% higher. Now, council tax, that doesn't exist in Toronto, or it's not the renter's responsibility to pay for the services in the community, versus here it's the renter or the resident's responsibility. So here is another like approximately extra £100 a month for council tax. Now, internet providers here in London, I think, are slightly cheaper than in Canada because I think there's just more competition in the market. So in Canada, I'm actually paying also the internet for the condo there. So I pay around 31 Canadian dollars for internet in Canada, and that is about £33.88 versus here when I was paying for internet before, it was around £23.33. So it's like about 30% cheaper. And then another one I'll add in here is your mobile phone. So I would say years ago when I used to live in Canada, like mobile data plans started at like $90 a month. It's gotten better now. So now I think you can get a mobile data plan between like $30 to $50. That's like quite fair. But in London, it is quite cheap. I would say you can get a pretty okay mobile data plan for like £10. If you want to go with like a bigger company, maybe £20. So I would say it hovers between 10 to 20. So comparison wise, in London is about 27% cheaper for mobile data. Next, let's talk about transportation. So in Canada, we don't have zones like they do here. You pay one fare and you have 2 hours to travel and you can transit for free. So onto the bus or the subway, and it costs $3.35 each way. So for a round trip, it will only cost you $6.70, which is about £3.72 for a round trip. Now in London, the pricing varies a lot depending on what zones you cross, if you're traveling on peak hours or off peak hours. So my typical round trip commute to work, so in the morning on peak hours and coming back off peak hours, round trip is about £5.20 for my daily commute. And that's about 40% higher than if I lived in Toronto. Now for Uber, so I try to compare the cost of the same distance to get into downtown or central London. So in Toronto, to go 20 kilometers from the suburbs to downtown, it's about $50, and that is about £27.77. Now for London, for the same distance, the cost is £40.78. I would say this has to also factor in that there is like congestion charges and different things potentially. So that makes it about 47% more, almost 50% to take Ubers in London. One thing I'm not going to mention here is about cars because I'm not too familiar. I would say most people that live in London don't drive a car or don't have a car, versus in Toronto, most people do have a car. Next, I'm going to cover dining out. So I'm going to go through 3 levels of dining out. McDonald's, so like fast food, and then kind of like budget, low-key casual restaurants, and then kind of like mid-tier restaurants. So I actually use McDonald's as a comparison, and I think they converted the price to the current price, because if I look at a Big Mac, it's about £4.93 in Canada, and in the UK it is £4.99. So I would say if you're having McDonald's here versus in Canada, it's about the same price at the moment. So now for like a casual budget kind of restaurant, I'm going to take my favorite Korean place in Canada, this tofu soup place at Yonge and Finch. So a tofu soup there is $15.95. I remember this used to be like $11.95 or $12.95 back in the days, but it's gone up to $15.95. I'm going to include an appetizer. So an appetizer there is like $7.50. I usually never get the appetizer, but let's just say for the comparison's sake, £7.50. So it is $23.45 to have a meal at the Korean place in Toronto. But we can't forget, you have to add tip and you have to add tax. So in the end, the total bill will equal $31.27, which is about £17.51. Now, I looked at a Korean place that I like to go to called Kanampocha and compared for the same item. So for a tofu soup and an appetizer, it is about £16. Now, I would say for most places do charge a discretionary tip now, so that is £12 12.5%, which is still less than an 18% tip in Canada, which is now the minimum, I think. So in the end, that bill will come up to about 18 pounds. So for a budget restaurant, I would say the cost is actually fairly similar. So 18 pounds compared to 17 pound 51 is like slightly higher in London. But I actually thought it would be more, but seems like for my typical like casual dining, I'm actually not paying that much more to live in London. Now let's compare like a mid-tier restaurant. I'm gonna use Joey as an example because they have pretty like standard, downtown pricing. Drinks are around $7 to $15. Starter is like 10, and then a main is like 22. So calculating that I got a main, a starter, and a drink, it's around $39. Now I add 18% tip, and then I add 13% tax, and I get around 52 Canadian dollars, which equals £29.12. For London, I think at a similar type of place, it would also be around 7 to 18, maybe 6 or 5 if you're getting a beer for a drink. A starter ranges from £7 to £14, and then mains can go anywhere from like 16 to £35. So if I got a drink that's 10 plus a starter that's another 10, and then a main that's like 25 pounds, it would be around 45 pounds times that discretionary charge, which is 12%, 12.5%. I don't know why they always do 12.5%. Why not 12 or just 13? Anyways, so that equals about 50 pounds, 63. So in this comparison, I feel like to eat in central London at a slightly nicer place, it's always a bit more expensive. So I think it would make sense that London is more expensive, and there's a lot more of these mid-tier restaurants in London compared to Toronto. Now, for alcohol, it kind of depends on where you go, of course. When I was looking at a place in Toronto, a beer is about $6 actually, so that's only £3.36 versus if you're getting a beer at a kind of pub in central London, it's actually going to be £6. So there is a price to drinking out. Cocktails, I feel like are similar price or a bit higher in London because there's a lot more nicer cocktail bars. So in Toronto, a cocktail might be $14 to $18. That's about like 7 to 10 pounds versus here, I feel like a cocktail starts at 10 pounds minimum here. And it can go all the way up to like 20 something pounds at somewhere nice. And then a glass of wine in Toronto is about $10 a glass or more. So that's about £5.60 versus in London is around £7. And then lastly, let's look at coffee. So I think in Canada, there's a wider range of coffee prices versus in London. Coffee is like pretty standard price no matter where you go. Like if you go to a Pret or a Costa versus like a specialty, it's about the same. So in Canada, at Tim Hortons, you can get a latte for about $3.49. And then after you add tax, it comes out to about £2.21. If you go to Starbucks, a latte is $4.95, and then you add tax, and then it's about £3.13. And then if you go to like a specialty coffee, so I used to go to Jimmy's Coffee near my work, it's about $5 for a coffee, for a latte there, so that comes out to around £3.16. So it can range anywhere from £2.21 to £3.16. Now in London, I think Pret is the go-to cheap coffee stop, but a latte there is still £4.05. And then at Starbucks, the same latte is £4.20. So it is a pound more expensive to get Starbucks here than in Toronto. And then a specialty coffee place, it can be like £4.50 to £5 for a latte, I would say. So overall, it seems like coffee is more expensive in London, but the coffee here is definitely more high quality and uses more high quality espresso. So I think you get what you're paying for. Next, let's talk about entertainment. So I'm going to compare just like a few things that I think entertainment-wise you have in common. Although I do think that London just in general has more things for people to do. So a typical movie in Canada costs between $10.99 to $12.99 for a ticket. After you add tax, it's about £6.90 for a ticket. Versus here, movies are quite expensive actually. I think at a normal theater, if you're not getting any discounts on like a Tuesday or something, it's £14. But there's also some more like luxe theaters, or if you want a recliner seat, it can go all the way up to like £25 for a movie ticket. But I gotta say, it's kind of worth it sometimes. It's a way better viewing experience. In Canada, I feel like most galleries are paid for and most museums are paid for. So if you're going to like the Royal Ontario Museum, that is $24 which is about £13.44, versus in London, most of the galleries are free, if anything, £10 maximum for a ticket. Now, for a 3-day music festival in Canada, for Veld, it is $390 for 3 days. That comes to about £218. And then for a music festival like Wireless here, it is £258.25. So it is a tiny bit more expensive here. Now for the club, which I haven't been in a long time, especially in Toronto, I think the typical club entrance fee is still hovering around $20, unless there's like special, special DJ or something on, then maybe it'll go up to 50. So that's about starting at £11.20. Versus here, I think clubs here are typically charge £20 to enter on like a normal night, and yeah, it can go up to £45-50. So overall, I think entertainment, it is higher in London for anything that is paid, but there is also a lot of free entertainment available in London, and just like more things to do in general. So it's hard to say if it really raises your lifestyle costs, because you can do other things, and I don't feel like I spend more on entertainment after moving to London. And then let's talk about some miscellaneous things. So like a gym membership. So I'm gonna compare a low cost gym membership like Planet Fitness in Toronto, which is about $24.99 plus tax per month. And that comes out to about £15.68. And it's actually an okay gym. It's not too bad. I mean, there's like a level below that, which is like probably like Fit for Less. So £15.68 a month for an okay gym. A comparable in London would be Pure Gym, and that is £27 a month. And there is a lot of gym memberships in London, a lot of different small gyms, and they're quite expensive, I would have to say. So in general, London is more expensive for gyms, and it makes sense since the cost for space and rent here is a lot higher as well. Another interesting one is I looked at ClassPass. So in Canada, for 34 credits, it's $79 per month, and that includes tax. So that comes out to about £43.88. In London, interestingly, they don't have a 34 credit option. It's 34 credits, but it's £45 per month. So if you're looking at the per credit cost, it is still more expensive in London. Another miscellaneous one is haircuts. So a cost for like a haircut in Canada is around like $75, but then you have to plus tip and tax, so that comes out to about £46.49. But in London, I feel like a typical haircut for like my length of hair is at least £75. And I find it a good practice to tip your stylist. So in the end, it'll probably end up being £90 for the haircut. And then clothing. So clothing wise, I actually think it's pretty evenly priced here, just for like local brands versus foreign brands. So if you're buying something more local or European, it's priced pretty reasonably. There's a big range of like low cost brands and like high end brands. So I don't think shopping necessarily is more expensive in London or in Toronto, but there is just more brands that are from London and Europe, so they tend to be cheaper. If you're buying the same brands, of course, in Toronto, it is more expensive. All right, let's compare an entire month of expenses from Toronto compared to the UK, including all the things I mentioned. So for rent, pretty straightforward, $2,300 on the Canadian side, $1,700 on the UK side. On the UK side, I'm going to add council tax at $101. On the Canadian side, there is nothing. Utilities wise, £67.20 on the Canadian side versus $130 on the UK side. Internet bills, slightly higher in Canada, so about £33.88. And then in the UK, £23.33. Mobile phone plan, it is about £27.84 on the Canadian side, and I'm going to average it to like an £18 plan from EE on the UK side. Now transportation, I'm going to assume you go out 7 days a week, one round trip each. So in Canada, a round trip each every single day for 30 days would cost about $201, which is £104.16. And then for UK, for the same amount of trips, it would cost £156.40, which is 50% higher. Now Uber, I'm gonna say you spend like $100 Canadian on Ubers at £56 on the Canadian side, and then I'm just gonna increase that cost by how much more it would cost to take the same trip in the UK, so that would be £82. Eating out and drinks, I'm gonna assume you get one coffee per week for 4 weeks, 2 drinks out per week for 4 weeks, dinners 2 times out per week. So that on the Canadian side equals about $496.97, and that's £278.30 for the same drinks, coffees out. Overall, that would be £336 for the month. Now for entertainment, I'm gonna kind of do the same thing. I'm gonna assume you spend kind of like £50 on entertainment in the UK, and I'm gonna deduct how much less everything would cost in Canada. So for the same £50, you could spend £28 and get the same activities, theoretically. Now for groceries, typically I'm gonna say in the UK, you'll spend £200 a month on groceries. And then in Canada, it's 33.5% higher. So I'm gonna put £267.02 for the same groceries on this side. And then on the miscellaneous items, maybe like a fitness class or things like that, you spend £50 on the UK side, and then on the Canada side, it is about 10% cheaper. So let's say you spend £45 on the Canadian side. For shopping, I'm gonna add just even £200 to both sides. So in the end, on the Canadian side, you would spend £2,390.40, which is about $4,268.57 Canadian. Versus on the UK side, for the same lifestyle, you would spend £3,046.73 or 5,440 Canadian. So looking at those, roughly it is 27% more expensive to live in the UK. Now, this doesn't really shock me because obviously I live here and I can feel it, how much I'm spending. And typically, I think just like going out is quite expensive here. And also you have this like fixed cost of living in London that is just so expensive, like the base cost of transportation and eating out and your rent. Like all these things are quite necessities, and you just pay more for them automatically. Like although it does help that groceries is cheaper here, it doesn't really subsidize anything else that of the costs that live in London. Now I think it's important to point out that salary here, although cost of living is 27% more than in Canada, I would say the salary here is the same as in Canada. So the converted salary of what you would make for the same job is the same here, or sometimes even lower. And I'm not quite sure why this is. I've had this conversation with a lot of my friends who are expats of why the salary is low here. But if anyone knows, let me know in the comments. But anyways, I hope that video was helpful. I hope I did all my math right. If you have any thoughts on Toronto or Canada living expenses, please leave them down below. And like and subscribe if you enjoyed this video, and I'll see you guys in the next one. Bye!